Okay, so welcome back for part 2 of my Celestial Dance series. Today we're going to be talking about the 8th century BC War in the Heavens. Now, if you have not seen the first part of this teaching, I highly recommend that you go check that out first. There are some operating assumptions and things that I will be alluding to heavily within this teaching, which will not make much sense to you unless you've seen the first part. So just hop on over to the other videos on my channel and find the part 1 of the Celestial Dance, and that will get you filled in and you'll be ready for the information in this one. Okay, so today, even if you've seen me present on this before, it's definitely worth sticking around towards the end of this presentation, because as I was putting it together, there were some other things that I had not previously presented which have now been incorporated into the teaching. The Father has just continued to pour out this information on me, and I'm excited about it. It's extremely important. What happened here in this 8th century BC war in the heavens has very, very long-lasting implications as it pertains to prophecy. So we will be spending some time in the books of Daniel and Revelation today, which is a subject that there are no small amount of opinions on, but I'm going to challenge the popular conventions today that many people in the Christian and also the Hebrew roots community perceive certain things to be true which are not true, and need to know certain things that are true but they don't know yet. So stick around towards the end of this teaching, please. It's really going to revolutionize the way that you read the books of Daniel and Revelation. Because I believe that this information, both the information about the 15th century BC Great Cataclysm and the War in the Heavens from the 8th century BC, I believe that these are the events that unseal the book of Daniel. It doesn't even make sense unless you understand these topics. So we're going to jump right into this here. Just as a very quick review on what we were talking about last week, there has been a 2,500-year-long effort to destroy historical texts that pertain to the 15th century BC and onwards. You can look at the burning of the Library of Alexandria as one example. You can look at the conquistadors burning entire stacks, piles of books of written histories by the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca. There's no reason to do that. Why? What is so dangerous about this information that it has to be destroyed? We're going to talk about that today. We talked about it a little bit last week, and I'm going to really bring that full circle today of what the danger is that was in these books. Moving on with the review here, there was a great cataclysm in the 15th century BC that was experienced by all nations of the earth, and this coincided perfectly with Israel's exodus from Egypt and was heralded in the sky by a streaking, fierce-looking star with horns and a red tail. Now we know that star to be called Venus today, so when you hear me say things like Venus did this or Mars did that, I'm obviously not talking about Venus and Mars from the Latin Roman pantheon of mythology. I am referring to the actual wandering stars, which we now call by those names. Now, I could call them by their Hebrew names, but most people wouldn't know what I was talking about, and it's just ingrained in our minds from the time that we're very young that these are the names of these things. So for the purpose of education, I'm going to be using those names in this presentation. So we know that Venus, according to multiple different ancient cultures, had horns and a red tail like a comet trailing behind it, and it was known to get very large in the sky before major events. Okay, so because of that, the nations began to worship the star, which we now call Venus, as they associated the events of the cataclysm with the star's motions. Easter and Passover traditions were born at that time in the 15th century. Now, all major ancient cultures agreed after that event that the new solar year was 360 days and the lunar month was 30 days. So there was no calendar arguments. There was no going back and forth between different beliefs regarding the calendar. The year was a perfect 360 days. There were 4 seasons that all lasted a perfect 3 months. The solstices fell on the same day every year, and the lunar month was exactly 30 days. So, during this time, it was harmony in the heavens. It was the heavens literally celebrating the matrimony between Yahuwah and his people Israel. Now, we also covered last time that 52 years after the Great Cataclysm of the 15th century BC, both Venus and Mars approached again during Joshua's conquest of Canaan. The sun and the moon both stopped in the sky for 24 hours, as confirmed by Native American sources and Chinese sources. All right. So during this time of the 360-day year and 30-day month, this is what I call the calm before the storm, right? This is the time that the motions of the lights in the heavens were in order, and it lasted a little over 700 years after the great cataclysm, and they were dancing in total harmony. During this time, the astrological beliefs of all peoples are solidified. So, outside of Israel, of course, everywhere, the entire world is realizing that there is harmony in the heavens, and so they come up with all of the different astrological beliefs are developed during this time period between the 15th and 8th centuries BC. Now, another interesting thing happened that's going to be important later is astrologers became coveted in the courts of kings. Okay, so when you read in the book of Daniel, and the king has had Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream that he needs to be interpreted, he calls all of his wise men and his astrologers, because in the courts of kings, astrologers were now at this point highly regarded because they knew how to read the celestial dance. They could look up at the sky and they could tell you what was going to happen based on what they saw there, and to some extent it was very accurate. And so the kings of the earth hoarded the best ones to themselves, and they were known for their ability to predict calamity and also the outcomes of war. Okay, so, and as I said before, Israel had no need to worry about any calendar adjustments. The new moons came when they should. The harvest festivals always lined up with the harvest that it was about. No intercalation was necessary because of the 360-day year and 30-day month. Intercalation is just a fancy way of saying how you catch up your religious calendar with the solar year. Now, we know from the book of, I believe it's Luke, when Yahuwah, Jesus, is talking about the things that would be happening in the earth prior to his coming. One of the things that he says is there are earthquakes, which are the beginnings of birth pains, right? And so earthquakes are not the only thing that is listed as a birth pain. There's also, famines and pestilence and war and things like that, which all can be considered birth pains. But earthquakes are one major sign that something's about to happen. And so when they pick up in both intensity and frequency, that is usually a sign that something's coming. And so this was the case. Okay, so if you fast forward into the kingdom age of Israel, there was a terrible string of earthquakes during the times of both of the Judah's kings, Uzziah and Ahaz. The earthquake during Uzziah's life was memorable for thousands of years afterwards, and was noted in its intensity, also being referenced multiple other places in Scripture. Okay, so you see this as it was in the times of the earthquake in Uzziah's time. I believe Jesus made reference to that, and it was referenced in a couple of the other prophetic books because it was so devastating. Right, so the archaeological evidence from where this was centered suggests that it was over an 8.0 earthquake. Now imagine that. It's like we saw those earthquakes in Turkey and a couple other places a couple years ago, and they were like 7.2s, and there's just absolute devastation. But every point that you go up on the Richter scale is twice the power of the previous number. So, an 8.0 or an 8.2, as some have even said that this earthquake was, I mean, that's twice as bad as those earthquakes, and so it's just absolutely devastating. And it here's the main point, though. It affected all of the Middle East. Okay, so you see records from the Assyrians and the different kingdoms that were active during this time talking about this same earthquake. All right, so, but it's also important to note, and we're going to talk more about this particular thing in part 3, but this event was preceded by an eclipse. All right, so an eclipse came first, and the earthquakes were the beginnings of birth pains for what would come a century later, which was the war in the heavens in the 8th century BC. Okay, so Amos, we're back to Amos. It's like Amos is all over this teaching because he was alive during this time, and he prophesied to King Uzziah 2 years before the earthquake came. Now, just a little bit of setting here. Basically, the people of Israel, or more particularly of Judah in this circumstance, were very wicked during this time, and there was one particular thing that just really made Yahuwah angry, And it was that they were waiting for the Shabbat, or the Sabbath day, to end so that they could hike up the price of grain and their goods. And so they were rushing the end of the Shabbat so that they could increase the price, because so nobody's been doing any commerce over the Shabbat, right? And so the vendors would hike their prices up right after Shabbat and get more money for something that they would have charged half that for during the middle of the week. And they were exploiting the Shabbat as a money-making opportunity. And I don't have to tell you that is absolutely ridiculous, and it caused them to totally forget the purpose of the Shabbat and the beauty of it and what it was for, and they exploited it for the reasons of money. All right, and so here in Amos chapter 8, verses 8 and 9, Yahuwah is talking about what he's going to do to them because they have gotten into this practice. Shall the land not tremble for this, and everyone mourn who dwells in it? And all of it shall swell like the river, heave and subside like the river of Mitzrayim. All right, so look at what's being said there. Again, it's like so much of this prophecy is using such subtle language, but if you understand what the event was, then when you put that together with the words, it makes sense. Shall not the land tremble? What is an earthquake? It's the land trembling, right? And then everyone who mourn who dwells in it, and all of it shall swell like the river, heave and subside. So what is a river doing, right? When the wind gets on a body of water, it goes to the left and it goes to the right, and it comes up and it comes down. And he's saying the land is going to do that, right? So during an 8.0 earthquake, that's what's going on in the land. The land looks like water. And it shall be in that day, declares the Master Yahuwah, that I shall cause the sun to go down at noon, and shall darken the earth on a day of brightness, and shall turn your festivals into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. Right? So we have independent historical records from other parts of the Middle East that said before this earthquake happened, there was an eclipse. So what happened? The day was darkened in the middle of brightness. That's what an eclipse does. When the moon gets in front of the sun, and or whatever it is that causes an eclipse. I'm not saying definitively that is even what that is, but regardless, it's going to cause dark on a day of brightness, right? So that happened. And if you go back to Amos 1 and 1, it actually says that this is the prophecy that Amos gave to King Uzziah 2 years before the earthquake. So it even dates that there in Amos 1:1, that this was 2 years ahead of time. All right, so now we have a war going on in the heavens, and this is very important as it pertains to prophecy. So let's pay close attention to this part. In the 8th century BC, all the nations of the earth again had cause for concern, as the dreaded wandering star Venus made an approach towards the earth, getting very large in the sky, again with Mars close behind, except this time something very different occurred. So all the nations of the earth are already worshiping and fearing this Venus figure, and then all of a sudden it's been gone for a long time, and then it shows up and everybody loses their minds, right? So just as Venus was getting close enough to actually affect the earth again, Mars was seen to alter course and collide with Venus in an epic collision that was both seen and felt, according to these ancient historical records. The Chinese describe these events as saying that both Mars and Venus were as large as the sun and the sky, and that they then began to clash into one another over and over again in an epic battle in the heavens that upset the motions of all the stars also. It was said that when they collided, the other stars in the sky began to fall like rain down to the earth in mass numbers. Now, I want to make a very definitive point here, and that is that the Chinese do not have any reason, okay, they have no reason whatsoever to try and corroborate anything that is in the biblical account. Okay, so this is just the Chinese talking about what they saw happen. This is not fantasy. It's not them writing a high epic fantasy, which was basically the ancient world's version of the movie theater. Okay, like this was not made for a play. Okay, this is a historical record saying that this happened. And so they're saying that Mars and Venus were both as large as sun in the sky, and then Venus on its approach gets collided with by Mars, and that every time they would hit each other, stars would fall out of the sky. Now, those of you who know the book of Revelation might know where I'm about to go with this, but it's important to note that the stars were falling out of the sky. Okay, so let's move on. Now, when the clashing of these wandering stars subsided, it was noted that not only did Venus no longer have horns or a red tail, but it was also much smaller. It has also followed a fixed path in the sky ever since. Its path is now predictable and steady. No more terrorizing the nations, no more cataclysms. Venus lost the battle. Mars was observed as having lost its sword aura from the conflict, but otherwise continued its typical behavior. It had accomplished what it set out to do and returned to normalcy. Many cultures then adjusted their religious practices to incorporate this star as their god of war, after having seen it deal a crushing defeat to the previously feared Venus. Right? So they've spent a little over 700 years worshiping Venus and giving it credit for the cataclysm of the 15th century BC, and then all of a sudden it makes a big approach, and they start to lose their minds, and then all of a sudden it's not the king of the sky anymore. All right, this Mars figure comes and literally collides with it over and over and over again, causing a bunch of stars to fall to the earth, and then all of a sudden Venus no longer has a tail behind it, and it no longer has horns, and it goes into what we now call a planetary orbit, which is a fixed, predictable orbit, right? And so how interesting that the different cultures of the earth saw this happen and changed their religious practices to mimic this. Now, this clash had catastrophic effects on the earth, but the damage was not as terrible as had been the devastation from the 15th century BC cataclysm. This event coincided with the events of the Trojan War and was described by Homer in the Iliad as having been Ares and Athena clashing over the outcome of the war. Right, so remember in the first time I talked about how different cultures gave different identities to different stars. Now, Athena is not the equivalent of Venus in the Greek and Roman and pantheons, but the Greeks saw Venus as being a symbol of Athena, and so while the Trojan War is going on, Homer is describing what he was seeing. Okay, so when it talks about the Ares and Athena clashing in the sky, it's literally talking about what actually happened, which was that these stars got very large in the sky and that they collided with each other. So of course all the different cultures of the earth are going to interpret this in different ways, but when you know what the Bible says about these things, you know what the real truth about it is. Now, something else happened after this war in the heavens was taking place, and so I call this one Not Again, because last time we talked about how the previous year was not 360 days and 30-day lunar month. It had been even shorter than that, and then all the nations of the earth had to change their calendars based on the changes after the 15th century BC cataclysm. Well, now after this war in the heavens, the year and the month have changed again. Okay, so afterward the nations of the earth once again all agree on something. Years were no longer 360 days. Months were no longer 30 days. Different cultures realized the changes at different times, depending on if their religious calendars were tied to harvests or seasons. Right, so some cultures didn't care whether or not their holidays lined up with certain festivals, and in fact to this day, Islam does not care when Ramadan or any of their other feasts of the sacrifice, whatever one you want to look at, they don't care that it lines up to any kind of harvest schedule, because they're only following the moon. So the moon is the entirety of the basis for their religious calendar. So they don't care that that doesn't line up with the solar calendar. But certain religions care very much, particularly the Hebrews, right? Because Pesach or Passover has to be tied to the ripening of the barley in Israel, because that's what Aviv literally means. And Aviv is the month when Passover is supposed to happen. Similarly, during the harvest of Sukkot, that has to be tied to the wheat harvest. So if this were to, get off course in any way from the solar year, there would have to be intercalation, and in fact there is. But other cultures didn't care, right? So the very first culture to notice that the length of a year had changed, and that more importantly that there was chaos in the heavens after this war, were the Chinese. Okay, and so this is a Chinese account that I'm about to read to you here. The Chinese were the first to identify the change. The very next year after the war in the heavens, in 721 BC, the Chinese astronomer Yi Heng related to the emperor, who is literally listed as the 18th since Yahu. Remember last time we talked about Emperor Yahu, how he was the one who lived through the Great Cataclysm, and he was renamed Yahu because that's the sound that the heavens and the earth were crying out while the earth was shaking, right? So in these records, this emperor that he's relating this to is the 18th since Yahu. But anyway, Yi Heng, the astronomer, is saying he can no longer predict eclipses. All right, so this is a major problem because, like I said before, the astrologers were brought into the courts to be predictors of calamity and outcomes of war, and one of the major ways that they did that was by being able to predict eclipses. And so just 1 year after this happens, the Chinese, this guy is already aware, wait a second, things are not lining up how they used to before. I can no longer predict your eclipses. Now, another interesting way that you can corroborate this event is, so this is called the 18th since Yahuwah, this emperor who this was related to. During that same amount of time, you have, I believe, 15 generations. I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but during that time you've had 15 Hebrew generations. So it's very interesting. You have two different cultures that have an almost identical number of generations in between these two time periods. Just lends credence to the reality of these timelines. Now, here's my particular favorite, okay, because the Assyrians were the ones who conquered northern kingdom Israel, and there is an Assyrian record that dates to 669 BC, and it's written on these little, they had these little almost like pyramid obelisk type things that the Assyrians would write their history on, and so there's a lot of these little obelisks around that are still in museums or just being kept safe different places that you can look and see what they were writing about. So in 669 BC, it states on one of these things that for over 20 years they had not celebrated a new year. Can you imagine, the news goes out on CNN that the New Year's celebration in New York City has been canceled. Can you even imagine that? It's like what that would do. I mean, New Year's celebrations are known to be the rowdiest celebrations in every culture in the world, no matter what their New Year even is. That culture associates that day as a day of partying, a day of celebration, right? And so this stone, what reason do the Assyrians have to lie about this? They hated Israel. They conquered Israel. They tried to conquer Judah. It's like, but no, they're saying in their own records that in 669 BC, that for over 20 years, they had not even celebrated their new year. Why did they not celebrate their new year? Because it was originally canceled when they noticed that the new year was happening in the wrong season. Okay, so their religious calendar didn't make them privy to this, but over time, the fact that the length of the year had changed and they didn't know it caused their New Year's celebration to happen in the wrong season. They're like, wait a second, it's hot outside, why is it the New Year, or vice versa. I'm not sure when they kept their New Year, but it's like that's how they noticed that the length of the year had changed, right? And so if you account for how long it would have taken for it to become that noticeable, this is a second witness for the 722 BC date for when these things changed. So if in 669 he's saying that for over 20 years, so let's just call that 670, add 20 years to that, that's 690 BC, right? And it would have taken probably 20 or 30 years for it to become very, very noticeable, because the length of the year going from 360 to 365, it's only 5 days a year difference. So it's going to take several years for that to become the entirely wrong season that this is happening in. So this is a second witness for the timing of when this change happened for the length of the year. Okay, but why, right? So last time I did a similar approach, and when we looked at the last cataclysm, it subjected all nations of the earth, and it was the result of Yahuwah's presence being on Mount Sinai when Moshe, who is Moses, was receiving the Torah. It was the earth, sun, moon, and stars singing praise and celebrating his matrimony. The resulting order in the luminaries was the sign that all was well, and that although rocky at times, the covenant relationship was still intact between Yahuwah and his people. But while this war in the heavens was raging between the wandering stars that we call Mars and Venus, what was happening in the realms of men? If the first cataclysm was directly tied to an event centered around Israel, was this heavenly battle also related to the goings-on in Israel? Remember, Venus and Mars had their appearances and courses changed forever. Many of the other stars of heaven fell to the earth, and the length of years and months were forever altered after this event. So what caused it? Divorce. Would you believe me if I told you that the year of this war in the heavens between Venus and Mars and the subsequent chaos in the luminaries, 722 BC, is the exact year that Northern Kingdom Israel was destroyed? The Assyrian Empire destroyed Shomron, their capital city, and carried away 9.5 of the 12 Israelite tribes into captivity over the course of 722 to 721 BC. This happened as a result of Yahuwah divorcing his people for their infidelity. So again, we have this massive celestial event going on, and it is directly tied. How you cannot say if it was even 1 or 2 years in either direction, then you could have plausible deniability for if this had anything to do with Israel. But it was the same year that Israel was destroyed by Assyria and taken away captive. That's absolutely incredible. So Yahuwah made the Sinai covenant with all 12 tribes of Israel. That's extremely important to remember. So if even one of them was conquered and carried away, it would break the marriage bond, right? So see Jeremiah chapter 3 for proof that Yahuwah divorced Israel, because it literally says there, I am writing you a certificate of divorce, O Israel. So I mean, these terms and these concepts, when I look at this as a marriage covenant, I'm not the one making that up. It says so in the Word, right? And so when you look at Jeremiah, he's literally saying, I've written you a certificate of divorce. I'm putting you away, right? And so that happened. And so just as the sun, the moon, and stars celebrated his wedding by becoming perfectly ordered, they mourned his divorce by reverting back to chaos. Right? And so that is why Paul said the whole creation anxiously awaits the revealing of the sons of Elohim and groans and travails in pain, from Romans 8. The creation is now grieving. And so the change in the length of the year and the way that it affected the stars and everything else that was going on, this is the creation's way of grieving the divorce of Yahuwah and his people Israel. Alright, so something has to now change in all of the calendars of the earth. Right, so they have been on a fixed calendar for so long, and now the year is obviously not lining up, so all the different cultures come up with their own way of intercalating their calendars. Right, so the Greeks developed a calendar system that kept the 360-day year and the 30-day month, but it would add a month every other year. And then, now this is according to Herodotus. Now Herodotus is considered the father of history and is one of the most reputable sources from the ancient world. I mean, he is highly praised. Okay, so that's where I'm getting this information for the Greek calendar system. That's going to be important in just a minute when we look at Daniel. But that is how they intercalated their calendar, and of course it was off. It was not good. And Herodotus himself even said that. He said that the Egyptians were better at intercalation, since they came up with a system where they kept their year at 360 days, but they added 5 days of nothingness on the end to be sure that the seasons aligned. So even during this time, in the 8th century BC, the astronomers and astrologers are so accurate with their studies that they figure out that there's 5 extra days. And it didn't take the Egyptians very long to figure that out, which is pretty incredible. So they come up with these 5 days of nothingness where just nothing would go on for these days. They would not celebrate anything. They wouldn't do anything. The children that were born during that time, their birthday would be on the first day of the next year. They just did nothing during this time of these 5 days of nothingness. But how interesting, and this is another proof for the fact that the world had at one time been on a 360-day calendar. Why would they have any reason to try and keep it at 360 days? If the calendar had never been 360 days for a total sun cycle, then why would all the nations of the earth in more recent antiquity have any reason to keep a 360-day year and then try to intercalate it by jumping all these hoops and ladders? Why not just have a 365-day year in the first place? Right? So that's not proof that they were, unable to measure the length of a year correctly, which is what academia will tell you. No, they knew very well how long a year was, but they still had a reason to keep the 360-day year, because that had been what they were used to for 700 years. Okay, so it should not then be any surprise that the first Jewish calendar reformer is King Hezekiah. Okay, now that's very important. He created the system which later became the foundation for the modern Jewish calendar, which is still in use to this day. Now, if the year had not always, been what it is, why would Hezekiah be listed in the Jewish histories as being the first person to reform the calendar? Okay, that's because during his lifetime something happened, and the length of a year changed. All right, now it's going to be important to note for here in a minute in this teaching that King Hezekiah was the king of Judah during the time when the northern kingdom Israel was destroyed and taken captive. Right? So this war in the heavens that happens, and the subsequent destruction of Israel, Hezekiah was the king during that time. So, when you look at that, and this last point that I have here, Hezekiah was the king of Judah when Israel was destroyed and carried away. So is it a coincidence that he was the first man to intercalate the calendar to the new year? No, he was the first king to experience the new length of a year. So it makes perfect sense. It would never make any sense if you didn't know the truth about the cataclysm and the war in the heavens. Now, armed with this information, armed with the fact that the length of a year changed, and that the Greeks intercalated their calendar by adding a month to every other year, I'm going to unseal definitively Daniel chapter 8. Let there be no more arguments. Let there be no more confusion. Let there be no more, problems with the book of Daniel. It's like this book was sealed when you read the end of it, and he says, put a seal on it until the time of the end. Well, I believe we're approaching the time of the end, and I'm going to unseal this chapter for you right now. Okay, so Daniel has had he's had a vision here, and he sees a ram that has two horns, right, and then there's another goat, and there's a big horn in between the eyes of the goat that comes and fights with the ram. And basically it is said that the goat would be the one that would set up the transgression of desolation, and that he would defile the temple and things like that. I'm not going to read the whole chapter 8 here. If you would like, you can go pause and go read the whole chapter 8, but I'm going to pick it up here at verses 13 and 14, which is where the important part of this is. Then I heard one Kodeshi. Kodeshi is a holy person or a set-apart person, or your scriptures may translate it as saint. I heard one Kodeshi speaking, and another said to that one which spoke, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily? Now the daily, I've heard all kinds of ridiculous interpretations about what is the daily, and they all stem from ignorance. If you read this in Hebrew, and I have studied this in depth in the Hebrew language, which is how most of the book of Daniel was written, some of it was in Aramaic as well, but the whole point here is that this daily that is being spoken of here is the Tamid offering. And if you're familiar with the Torah, you know what the Tamid offering is. The Tamid offering is the morning and evening sacrifice of a lamb that happened every day, all the time, continual. It was not to ever stop, right? And so that's why the English translators called it the daily, because this had to be done every day, in the morning and in the evening. All right, and so this Kodeshi, or presumably an angel, is speaking to another one and saying, how long is this vision concerning the daily? Because it was said that the goat would take away the daily, or the Tamid, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. Now that wording there, trodden underfoot, is important. We're going to see that wording come up again in Revelation, and we'll talk about it more then. But he said unto me, unto 2,300 Erev Boker. Now I put that in Hebrew because your Bible is going to say unto 2,300 days, probably. Or if it's a very accurate translation, it's going to say, 2,300 mornings and evenings, or evenings and mornings if they're even more accurate. Nobody's known what to do with this. I can't tell you how many different commentaries that I read throughout my life about what this is talking about, because the first time I stumbled across it, it bothered me, and I wanted to know what the truth of it was. And I heard, preached to me the Seventh-day Adventist take on this from Ellen White, and all that, really poor eschatological belief that the 2,300 days is this period of time the heavenly sanctuary is being cleansed of our sins, and all this stuff that's completely ridiculous. So of course in 1844 nothing happened, right? Because you're not understanding what Daniel is saying here. It's very important to note that in Hebrew, when you read this part of it, it does not say the word for days. It does not say the word for evenings and mornings. Okay, it's singular. Both Erev, which means evening, or it comes from Arab, or like mixture. So it's talking about the sky. When the sun is setting, how the sky turns colors. That's what Erev is. okay, and boker is morning. Okay, so it's kind of the flip side of that, but when the sun is coming back. So that is when the sanctuary shall be cleansed, is after 2,300 evening, morning, is how that should be read. Not days, okay, because it would make Erev and Boker plural if it meant evenings and mornings as being a day, right? So that's not plural in the Hebrew. You have to understand that that is not plural in the Hebrew. And this is just a very enigmatic way to say this. 2300 Erev Boker. What could that possibly be talking about? Well, I'm going to, I'm going to settle this issue. If anybody has any arguments for this, I would love to hear what it is, because this issue is now settled. But I'm going to get to that in just a second. So 2300 Erev Boker, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. All right, now I'm going to jump over to verses 20 through 23, because the angel is literally going to tell you who is the ram, okay, who is the goat, what is it talking about. This is not an end times prophecy. This was talking about something that was going to happen shortly thereafter, in historical terms, shortly thereafter Daniel's lifetime. So to Daniel, this was prophecy, but it's already happened. All right, and so when we look at the books of Daniel and Revelation, we've got to be able to use discernment and find the things which have already happened, determine which things are end times prophecy, some of them are, and determine which things have happened between then and now by having a healthy understanding of history. All right, so the angel is saying this, not me. The ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the kingdom of Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom. Now, this is the part that you have to get a hold of. If you've ever thought that Daniel 8 was talking about the future, you got to look and see what he's saying here. In the latter time of their kingdom being Greece. You know, the angel literally said Greece is what this is talking about. So towards the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Okay, and it goes on and on to talk about the things that this guy does, who rises up at the end. But I wanted to point out towards the end of their kingdom, towards the end of the Greek kingdoms. Okay, because this ended up happening exactly. What is being described here is exactly what happened in Greece. Okay, so the horn between the eyes of the goat is Alexander the Great, who did everything Daniel said he would. When Alexander died, Greece was split amongst his 4 generals, Cassander, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, the horns from this prophecy. Now each Greek kingdom controlled massive portions of land, and each served as its own empire. Judah fell under the sovereignty of the Seleucid Empire. Long afterward, towards the end of the Greek beast system, a king named Antiochus Epiphanes took control of the Seleucid Empire by cunning devices, and he persecuted the Jews in a way that few had ever dreamed possible. You really just have to read the book of Maccabees to see how bad it was. I mean, and I put that there on purpose. Like, if you've not read Maccabees, you need to do it. What Antiochus Epiphanes did was absolutely horrendous. Okay, but anyway, during his conquest of Judah, Antiochus defiled the temple by offering a pig on the altar, and he set up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies. Now the writer of the book of Maccabees tells you that that was the abomination that brings desolation. Okay, now the word abomination that is being used here is literally the same word from the Torah that talks about idols. Okay, so this abomination is not going to be any of the other types of abomination. There's several different words that get translated as abomination in English. The shikutz shamim, I believe is how it's listed in Hebrew, that this is literally talking about an idol which brings destruction. Now we talked about in the first part of this teaching how it was that the kings of Judah had gotten into celestial worship. Right, and so remember that passage from Jeremiah that says the bones of the kings of Judah will be strewn out on the ground and left there for dung because they have worshipped the stars. Right, and they put images of the stars in the holy place. So that had already happened before Antiochus Epiphanes. All right, they did that themselves, and what happened? They were destroyed. Okay, so that is the abomination that brings destruction, or that brings desolation. Right, and so That's why they knew what this was when Antiochus did it and what it meant. Okay, so he comes and he brings the statue of Zeus, or what we would now call Jupiter, and puts that in the Holy of Holies. And he cast down the priesthood and replaced him with a priest who was friendly to him, and he took away the Tamid offering. Okay, so this taking away of the daily, or what is continual, or the Tamid offering, is something that Antiochus Epiphanes did, right? And so that's what was prophesied would happen in Daniel 8 that we just read, is that this leader would do that. Okay, so and I've got here that he forbade that it should be offered, and he did. Daniel 8 in particular has confounded even the wisest of all commentators for millennia, but now, armed with the truth of the two cataclysms, I'm going to show you what really happened and how this chapter of Daniel was completely fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes. So to find the truth of this, we got to go to the book of Maccabees, which was at one time considered scripture and fairly recently was taken out of Protestant Bibles, but is still in Catholic Bibles. First Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 54. We've got somebody doing some very faithful scribe work here, and I'm so glad that they did, or else we would never know what this meant. So, First Maccabees 1:54. Now, the 15th day of the month Kislev, which is in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar. Okay, so we've got some faithful scribe sitting here telling us the day of the month that this happened. Now, I want to prove to you with this verse that the Jews are under the sovereignty of the king of Greece, okay, or more particularly the Seleucid Empire. And so they're using the Greek way of computing their years, because it says the 15th day of the month Kislev. Now, they just took their month names and they imposed them onto the Greek calendar. So for religious purposes, they used their own Jewish calendar, but for any kind of official administrative purposes, they were using the Greek calendar, because it says there in the 145th year. What, the 145th year since what? Right? And it tells you in other places that it's the 145th year since the reign of the kings of Greece. Okay, so the writer of this book is literally using the Greek way of computing the year there. In the 145th year of the kings of Greece is what it is, the full title of how they usually listed that. Right, so during that year, on that day of that month, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar. Now, this great war ensues, and it is led by a man named Yahuwah Maccabee, who is a hero. If you've never read the book of Maccabees, I strongly recommend it. If you want to see heroism and bravery and somebody who stands on the word of his Elohim and fights against a beast system, there is no greater example of that than Yahuwah Maccabee. Right, because once the beast systems were incorporated, you have very little effective resistance against them, because the beasts really were only allowed to take form after Israel was destroyed. So that really the one pristine example of somebody mounting a revolution against a beast system and it actually being successful, the only time that I'm aware of that has ever happened, is from Yahuwah Maccabee. So read the book. Anyway, Yahuwah Maccabee and his brothers end up taking back what was taken by the Greeks, right? So they regain control of the temple, and they cleanse it. They had to tear down the altar and all the stones that were involved in it and everything. I mean, there was some major defiling that had taken place, but they set up a new altar and they restored the sacrifices. And the writer of Maccabees tells you what day, on what month, of what year that this happened. So on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose up early in the morning and offered sacrifices according to the Torah on the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. So we know from this that it was 3 years and 10 days from the time that the daily, or the Tamid offering, was taken away, when the sanctuary was cleansed and it began to be offered again. We also know they're using the Greek method of timekeeping. So let's look at this. The Greeks have 360-day years still at this point, so 3 years has transpired during this time. So 3 times 360 is 1,080 days, right? And so there would have been two intercalation months added in this process, because remember, they add a 30-day month at the end of every other year. So the first year would have had a 30-day month added to it, and then the third year would have had a 30-day month added to it, which is 60 days. So when you add those two up, you've got 1,080 days plus 60 is 1,140 days. Now we know that it was taken away on the 15th of the month Kislev and then reinstated on the 25th. So there's 10 days there that you have to count for. So we have 1140 days, and then plus the 10 days for the different days of the month, and you have yourself 1150 days. Now remember, 2300 Erev Boker for the Tamid offering, which was twice daily. So we have to times that number by 2, because that's how many times that this offering would have been offered, twice each day for 1150 days. And guess what we get? 2300. You cannot make this stuff up. Okay, so Daniel, with perfect accuracy, said the exact number of sacrifices, one in the morning, one in the evening, that were interrupted from the time that Antiochus Epiphanes took control of the temple and until Yehuda Maccabee and his brothers regained control of it and reinstituted the sacrifices. It's exactly 2300, not 2310, not 2200. Okay, it's exactly 2300 sacrifices that would have been interrupted during that time, and it's exactly what Daniel said. Now, there would be no way for you to know this, and indeed none of the commentators that I've ever seen understood this, because they didn't know that the year used to actually be 360 days, and that it changed at some point, and that was why there was all this crazy intercalation going on during this time. So if you understand the Greek intercalation, which would have been in use by the Judeans of this time, because they were under the rule of the Greek king, that in the record keeping for this, it is 2300 sacrifices were altered, or that 2300 would have been offered during that time, but weren't because it was defiled, and then they pick it up right on time, and it's exactly as the book of Daniel said. How incredible. It's absolutely amazing. Hallelujah. So now that we understand that, I want to take a look at some other places of Daniel, right? And we're going to look at this time period called time, times, and half a time. All right, Daniel 7:23 through 25 reads, "Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them. And he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against El Elyon, and shall wear out the Kodashim of El Elyon, and think to change the times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time." Now I could speak for 2 hours on just this verse. I'm not going to go into detail about all the different aspects of it, but as we go through these scriptures, I've color-coded red for the things that this beast system is allowed to do, and blue for the amount of time that it's going to be allowed to happen, right? So he's allowed to change the times and the laws. Everything is given into his hand. He's going to wear out the Kodashim. The Kodashim is the plural form of Kodeshi. It just means set apart ones, holy ones, saints, Yahuwah's people, however you want to render that. It's saying that he's going to wear them out. So he's going to prevail against them. All right, so it was told in Daniel's time that there would be a time period that would last time, times, and the dividing of time, and that's how long this person would be able to wear out the Kodashim of El Elyon. Okay, so time, times, and half a time. That word there can also mean year. So really what it's telling you here is 3.5 years. And so what I'm about to show you in these next couple of slides is going to completely shoot down the modern belief within Christianity that there is 3.5 good years and then 3.5 years of tribulation. We were fed this from the Left Behind series, and we're going to go over the same scriptures where they came up with that belief, but I'm going to show you definitively what it was actually talking about. Because remember, in the first part of part 1, I said that days are taken for years in prophetic fulfillments, and I gave you 2 examples of that. And these are going to be more examples as well. So when you see times, and the dividing of time, that's telling you 3.5 years. It's just a fancy prophetic way of saying it. Now, let's look at Revelation 13 and 15. Okay, so we're talking about the same beast doing the same things, and for the same amount of time. "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies." Remember, that basically said the same thing in Daniel 7. "And power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Now, how long is 42 months? If you do the math, there's 36 months in 3 years, and you got 6 left over. 6 months is half of a year, so 42 months is the same amount of time as times time and a half of time. It's the same thing as 3.5 years. So remember, the red is talking about what he's allowed to do, and the blue is talking about how long it can last. So it's basically the exact same thing being said here as what was said in Daniel 7. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against Yahuwah, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the Kodashim and to overcome them. Again, same language as from Daniel. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Alright, so I've got here at the bottom of the slide, time times and half a time is the same amount of time as 42 months, or 1260 days, right? So 1260 days, if you're using a 360-day calendar, which we know Daniel did, and which we know was the calendar during the 700 years of Israel being in the land and everything, 1260 days on a 360-day calendar is exactly 3.5 years. So when you see 3.5 days, times time and a half a time, 42 months, 1260 days, it's all talking about the exact same amount of time. So let's look at Revelation 17, 1 through 6 real quick, because it's a third witness to what this beast was going to be allowed to do, and more importantly, who the woman is that rides the beast. Come here, and I will show unto you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman set upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was written a name, Mystery Babel the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the Kodashim, and with the blood of the martyrs of Yahushua. Okay, so here's another witness that there's a period of time that lasts for times time and a half a time, or 42 months, which this beast is allowed to overcome the set apart ones, or the saints, or the holy ones, right? So this woman here, I'm going to tell you with absolute certainty, that is talking about the Catholic Church. When you get involved in the study of the different women of scriptures, the pure and undefiled lover is the set apart, called out assemblies of Yahuwah and the servants of Yahushua. There's a real church and a false church. The false church is this great whore and the mother of harlots, and the true church is that church which has come out and renounced any association with denomination or with the Catholic Church itself. That's another topic for another day, but that is who that is talking about there. And further proof of that is given in the next chapter in Revelation 18. It says, basically, give her punishments as was her way, for she did not act as a widow. Okay, so we as the female assembly, or as the bride of Yahushua, are in a widowed state of existence, because Yahushua is not with us in person. He's with us in spirit, and that is great. However, we are to behave ourselves as a widowed church until he comes back, meaning we have not taken another man as our head. But the Catholic Church has taken another man as their head. There is a pope, there is a vicar of Christ, right? And he is the head of that filthy church. And so they have joined themselves unto him, and have taken a new mediator of the covenant. They have committed spiritual fornication, and that is why they are called a whore, and that's why they are called the mother of whores, because the denominations which came out from the Catholic Church have all turned around and done the same thing. Now, they don't call them popes, they'll be called something else, but at every organizational, denominational church, you have a man at the head of it, and it is a harlot church system, and it is about to be destroyed. If you find yourself in a denominational church at this point in time, you need to get out. I cannot say that with stern enough words. Come out of her, my people. Be not partakers in her sins, because these 501c3 incorporated churches are answering to Rome. You don't see it, but it's happening. I promise you. In dark rooms, they are answering to Rome. You are a part of the harlot church system. If you are in a denominational church, you need to get out and find yourself a non-denominational group that has got true spirit-filled led leadership. That is my 2 cents on that issue. Anyway, we see here in the red letters that these are the things that are given to the beast to be able to do for a certain amount of time. Now I made this little chart here, so I'm going to go over it times time and half a time. I've got the blue letters there at the top: year, years, half a year. Okay, so that's 3.5 times 360 for the year. That's 1260 days. That's the amount of time that this was going to be allowed to happen. Now the Catholic Church, as I just said, is the fulfillment of this. So in 538 AD, if you look at the left of this timeline, 538 AD, the Catholic Church is handed the political reins of the world. Okay, the Catholic Church had been in existence for, I believe, a couple hundred years at this point. Under Constantine, they received their original charter. However, under Justinian, in 538 AD, they come into actual political power. And there's a big difference between the Catholic Church existing and being in political power. When they gained political power in 538 AD, they set out to completely destroy all dissenting opinions regarding the scriptures, and that's very important to note. So I call these the 1260 years of blood, because during this time, all of those scriptures that we just read about how they would make war with the Kodashim and overcome them, or it was given unto them to tread them down, that's what was going on during this 1260 year period of time. So in 538 AD, the Catholic Church takes political power, but then it is dethroned by Napoleon's General Berthier in 1798. So this lasted exactly 1260 years. You can't make this stuff up. Just like how the prophetic fulfillment of Daniel 8 was so perfect to the exact number of sacrifices. You see here again in Daniel that exactly 1260 years the Catholic Church is in political power and kills, if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, a conservative estimate is 300 million people were killed by the Catholic Church during this time. And this was admitted by Pope John Paul II, who during his lifetime apologized to the world for the actions of the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages. Oh, he apologized. That makes it better. 300 million people were killed by the Catholic Church. Why? Because they wanted to celebrate Passover. Why? Because they wanted to, remain Jewish even after converting the converts that came from Judaism. They were killed because they had dissenting opinions about the scriptures. Why were they killed? Because they wouldn't pay the stupid indulgences, right? There was a period of time here where the Catholic Church was charging people money to take time off time spent in purgatory. And so if you came and you gave a large contribution to the Catholic Church, then they would give you a little receipt that said, okay, your loved ones have had 20 years taken off their time spent in purgatory. Thank you for your indulgences. And it's like, that's so disgusting. How is this even allowed to happen? Well, it's allowed to happen because they destroy the scriptures. Okay, they translate everything into Latin and then wouldn't let anybody have any of their own copies of the scriptures. They maintained total dominance over the scriptures, and so then the priest would tell you, oh yeah, this indulgences thing, it's in the Bible, so you should do it. And the people are ignorant and they don't have their own copies, so they're like, okay, yeah, we'll go along with it. And the people who didn't, guess what? They got burned at the stake. They were beheaded. They had oil poured on them, and they were set on fire. I mean, you name it. Horrible things that the Catholic Church did to the Kodashim during this time. But it was prophesied that it would happen. Okay, it was prophesied by John. You got to remember, this happens after John wrote the book of Revelation. 500-ish years later is when this began. So at the time, it was prophecy. But when we look at it now, we're past the time where that was the case. Okay, it is not given to the beast to trample us down anymore. That time is fulfilled. The blood of the Kodashim has stained the ground, and that righteous blood is calling up to the throne right now. But that time ended in 1798 AD. We don't have to be subject to that anymore. We don't have to roll over and just say, oh yeah, we're just going to all be killed whenever this beast system comes into its fruition. No, you do not. That is not going to be the outcome of all of the assemblies. He is going to fight for Israel during this time that we experience this Exodus, and it's going to be just like how he protected them during the first Exodus. The time that was given to the beast to wear out the Kodashim has passed. It was during this 1260-year period of time of world history. But this is what was also being talked about by John in John 9:4 when it says, "For the night is coming when no man can work." Okay, The Dark Ages. Why do you think they call them the Dark Ages? It's like the Catholic Church ruined 1260 years of human history. Okay, but anyway, moving on here. I want to talk now a little bit, now that you understand that 1260 year period of time. You may have heard that before. You may have heard me talk about that. You may have heard that from many of your ministers in your Christian denominations. But I'm going to tell you that there's two different 1260 year periods. That's the one that people are familiar with, but I'm going to show you the other one now. Okay, so but to understand this, we've got to go back to Revelation 11. In the holy city they shall tread under, oh, there's that tread underfoot again. Remember we saw that in Daniel? Now how long do they do this? 42 months. How interesting. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,203 days. A score is 20. 1,203 score is 1,260. So how interesting. Again, in this one little portion of Scripture, we've got the 42 months and we've got the 1,260 days. It's the same amount of time. Okay, it is the same amount of time. Now we're going to talk about what this all means in a second. But during this time that the 2 witnesses are prophesying for 1,260 days, they're clothed in sackcloth, which is also important. These are the 2 menorahs standing before the Elohim of the earth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power to shut the heavens, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues, as often as they will. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. Okay, so with these 2 witnesses, what we're seeing is that there's a congruent pattern here. And you have to look for congruent patterns when you're trying to understand prophecy. You also have to understand that Revelation is a book of symbols. Where people go wrong with this book so often is by not realizing that this is a book of symbols. You cannot take literally what you're looking at in the book of Revelation. Or very rarely can you. Because this is prophetic. Alright? You have to really let the Ruach reveal to you what these symbols mean, because it's done this way on purpose. Do you think the Catholic Church would have allowed this book to continue to exist if they knew what was being said about them? Okay, it had to be written in this way that it was impossible to understand, so that it could be concealed from the eyes of those who think themselves wise, and it could be revealed unto babes, because that is how the Father works. Yes, Father, for it was good in your sight to do it this way. So anyway, so we see here that the congruent pattern that I was talking about is that for these 2 witnesses, it is said that they will have 42 months where they're allowed to prophesy, right? Where this is going to be good for 1,260 days, but then the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. Same wording that was used about what the beast would do to the Kodashim. So let's move on. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Master was crucified. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half. So again, 3 days and a half, 1,260 days, times time and a half a time, 42 months, it's all the same thing. And shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. So the 2 witnesses are now dead, but they're not buried. And that's very important to remember. They're dead but not buried. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented them that dwelled on the earth. And after 3 days and a half, there's that same number again, the spirit of life from Yahuwah entered into them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up here. And they ascended up to heaven. They were called before the throne, essentially, and which is a prophetic statement, and we'll talk about what that means. Now, remember, the 2 witnesses, what were the things that they were allowed to do? They shut up the heavens that it would not rain. Fire proceeded out of their mouth and consumed their enemies. The waters were turned to blood, and plagues were put upon everyone. All right, I'm going to tell you that these 2 witnesses are not 2 people. We're not waiting on these people to show up. They're not going to be the ones that set right everything in the Torah and show us the right way for 3.5 good years. No, this has already happened. Okay, the 2 witnesses are Moshe, Moses, and Elijah. Right? Eliyahu prophesied against King Ahab. If you go back and read 1 Kings, you'll see this. Eliyahu prophesied against King Ahab and caused it to not rain upon Israel for, how long did it not rain? You guessed it, 3.5 years. All the way back through in the Old Testament. He shut up the heavens, and that lasted in that story for 3.5 years, or 1260 days, since the 360-day year was still in effect at that time. Okay, Eliyahu also caused fire to come down and consume his enemies. So shutting up the heavens, the amount of time, and fire consuming his enemies, Eliyahu fulfills all of those parts of what was said about one of the witnesses here. Now Moses caused the waters to turn to blood, and brought the rest of the plagues during the Exodus. Alright, so that is not the limit of the similarities that these two men have. Okay, so they both also did something else. Both went on 40-day fasts and went on top of Mount Sinai at the fast during their lives. Okay, so both were also present at the Transfiguration. So, you remember when they and the Father were witnesses to Peter, James, and John that Yahuwah was in fact the Messiah. So if you go and you read Mark chapter 9, if you want to pause this and go read that, Mark 9, 2 through 9, basically what is happening here is, he brings along 3 witnesses with him in the form of Peter, James, and John, and takes them on top of a high mountain. It does not tell you which mountain, which I think it's probably Mount Sinai, but I can't prove it. But he goes on top of a mountain, Yahuwah himself having gone on a 40-day fast not long before this. And these two men in the Old Testament, Moshe and Eliyahu, 40-day fast, they went on top of Mount Sinai, and then when Yahuwah Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John, guess who is standing there with him? Okay, Moshe and Eliyahu. There's even in the Mark account of this event, Peter even talks to them and says, "Let me build you booths. It is good for you to be here." Because he's like, he doesn't even know what to say. He's just at a loss for words. Can I make you a booth? What do you want, Moshe? What do you want, Eliyahu? It's so great that you're here. Okay, so their role as witnesses in this exchange seals the deal on who these two people are. They are the witnesses in Revelation, and symbolically, okay, because remember, Revelation is a book of symbols. Symbolically, they are the Torah and the prophets. The books, the collection of books, which also serve as Yahushua's witnesses. Okay, so what is being said here when it talks about the two witnesses? It's obviously Moshe and Eliyahu, but one is symbolic of the Torah and one is symbolic of the prophets. Because we know that the Torah and the prophets were the greatest witnesses that Yahushua is in fact the Messiah. Okay, so having established that, let's move forward here, and we're going to look at some more times that we see this 1260 days, or 3.5 days, 42 months. We're going to see all this some more. Okay, but this is really the crux of the matter. Revelation 12 is how we ended up talking about the celestial dance in the first place. A lot of you probably remember the Revelation 12 sign thing that was going on last year with Scott Clark and a couple other guys talking about this. I was a happy observer of all of that. I didn't get involved in it, and I didn't fully accept what they were saying, but it did call my attention to these concepts. And so I'm thankful for all of that, because it helped me know that I should get to know the stars a little bit better. And of course, they were saying the rapture has to happen at this time, and I didn't get on board with that. You can't put Yahuwah in a box and tell him that he has to do something at any given time. Even if he was planning on it, I think he would then not do it just because somebody said that he would. Because it's made very clear that we don't know the day or the hour. We can know the season, but not the day and the hour. Okay, so Revelation 12 though is going to go into some really great stuff here. I'm excited about this. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads, and his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto Yahuwah, and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by Elohim, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now, most people understand what I told you earlier about the 1260 years of the Catholic reign of terror on the earth, from 538 AD to 1798 AD. But there is clearly another time period of 1,000 260 days, or 42 months, where things are good, right? And so this is the basis for the whole concept of 3.5 good years and then 3.5 years of tribulation. That's all based on the fact that there's obviously two different periods of time here being talked about. One period is always symbolic of protection, or they're allowed to prophesy, or she goes to a place where she's nourished or she's protected, but then there's a time where they're given over into its hand, and it's going to make war with the saints and overcome them. So there's a clear distinction between these two different 1260 day period of times, which are actually 1260 years. So moving on here with Revelation 12. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and did not prevail. Neither was there found place any more in heaven for them. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our Elohim, and the power of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our Elohim day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they loved not their lives unto the death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. Woe unto the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time. Alright, so what is this part of the teaching called? War in the heavens, right? This is what was going on in the 8th century BC. It's all being described for you here in Revelation 12, but I'll get more into that in a minute. So, continuing on. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for time, times, and half a time. Okay, so if there was any doubt in your mind that the 1260 days, or 3.5 days, 42 months, times time and a half a time, if this is talking about the same amount of time, here in Revelation chapter 12, it literally interchanges earlier on the woman being nourished in a place prepared for her for 1260 days, and then now it says times, time, and a half a time. So clearly these are talking about the same amount of time, because this same verse in Revelation, or the same chapter in Revelation, is literally using these terms interchangeably. From the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which guard the commandments of Yahuwah, and have the testimony of Yahushua HaMashiach. Amen and amen. So we see here that there is clearly a time period where the woman is protected, okay, but there's also clearly a time when she's not. Okay, which is what we just looked at with the 1260 years, where the Catholic Church was allowed to just murder hundreds of millions of innocent people who were all trying to worship Yahuwah in their own way, and the Catholic Church would have none of it. But during this time, she's protected. So what's going on here? If from 538 AD to 1798 AD, she's delivered over to, the beast system and the dragon, then what is this time of protection? And that's something that I've always wondered until I understood the truth of the cataclysm and the war in the heavens. So we're going to move on here. I've made a timeline. So everything that we just read is on here somewhere. Okay, so this is I call this the Revelation 11, 12, and 13 timeline, because I'm going to take all the different places where you saw that same 1260 days, 42 months, whatever, and now here it is on a timeline. Okay, so if you look at the middle of this timeline, 538 AD is the middle point. And from then onwards to 1798 AD is what we've already looked at, right? So remember we read in Revelation 11 that the city is tread underfoot for 42 months, right? So what is the city? If you fast forward, I believe it's chapter 21 of Revelation, where the angel says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." And I saw Jerusalem, right? So the holy city is the same thing as the woman. It's the bride. And the angel even tells you that later on in Revelation. So when it says that the city is tread underfoot for 42 months, it's the same thing as the people of Elohim being turned over and tread underfoot, right? We saw that terminology from Daniel 8 earlier. And what did it mean when Antiochus Epiphanes was trampling underfoot the sanctuary and the people? He was ruling over them harshly. So if you see here at the bottom of this, I've got a key, right? So the woman is Israel, Jerusalem is the bride, the floods are wars, okay? Seas are people. So where you have a flood, it's a body of water or a people coming up over its boundaries. So during wars, you have an invading country, and so that is a water or a people flowing over its natural boundaries and making a flood, and that's why floods are wars in prophetic literature. We talked about how the two witnesses are Moshe and Eliyahu, the Torah and the prophets. We have, earthquakes are social upheaval or unrest, and the man-child is the remnant. Okay, now I haven't gotten into that in any great detail. I'm going to in just a minute. But tread underfoot, ruled over harshly or persecuted, and then caught up to the throne means to be beyond the reproach of men. Okay, you have to understand that. Yahuwah, when he was dying on the cross, he said, "It is done." When he resurrected, he goes up and is caught before the throne. The same thing happens for the two witnesses, right? So if you look at the second half of this timeline I have here, it says the two witnesses are dead but not buried for 3.5 days. Afterward, they resurrect and are called to the throne, right? So the Torah and the prophets, during the time that the Catholic Church was in power, they had full control over the scriptures. They wouldn't let anybody translate it into their own language. They would kill them if they even tried, right? So the two witnesses, the Torah and the prophets, the scriptures, the holy scriptures, right? They were dead. They weren't allowed to work because they were in the hands of an unfaithful steward who was not allowing their witness to continue, and so during that time when the Catholic Church had total control, they weren't allowed to witness. They were dead, but they were not buried. Okay, and then it rewind from that time, the two witnesses are allowed to witness for 1260 days. It says that at the beginning of Revelation 11, that they witnessed for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth, though. Okay, so sackcloth is a picture of repentance, of brokenness, particularly of brokenness, right? So if a wicked person wanted to get Yahuwah's attention and really repent of their sins and be made right, he would put on sackcloth. Right, so they're clothed in sackcloth during that 1260 days from Revelation 11. And during that time, it says fires devour their enemies, all the signs of who they are right there. But that's the same time period that it says that the woman is protected for 1260 days and is nourished for time and a half of time. But then afterwards, power is given unto the beast to continue 42 months to make war and to overcome. That's from Revelation 13 that we read. So the city is tread underfoot for 42 months, but the woman is protected for 1260 days prior to that. The witnesses are allowed to witness for 1260 days, but then they are dead but not buried for 3.5 days. It's the exact same thing. Okay, it's the same amount of time, but different circumstances, right? So I've got times here on this timeline for 538 AD unto 1798 AD. But what happens if you count backwards? From that fateful moment in 538 AD, if you count backwards 1260 years, where do you think that puts you? I'm not going to make you do that grueling math, converting from AD to BC, but I'm going to tell you that if you go backwards 1260 days from 538 AD, you come to 722 BC, the same year that Israel was destroyed and carried away captive, is the time that the witnesses began to witness, clothed in sackcloth in a time of repentance, because the Israeli people, if you read 2nd Esdras, it tells you that they realized what they had done, that they were terribly, terribly repentant of the fact that they had been stripped of their land, but it was too late. They were divorced. Okay, so the two witnesses of the Torah and the prophets witnessed clothed in sackcloth and in the repentance of the 10 northern kingdom tribes who realized what they had done, but it was too late. They were now a part of the nations. And so 722 BC, fast forward to 538 AD, you have exactly 1260 years of actual human history. That no matter where those 10 tribes, wherever they went in their dispersion, no matter which war tried to consume them, or everywhere that they went, they still existed. They may not have remembered who they were, but they still existed. The woman was protected during that time period. Okay, and so remember, at around 30ish AD is when Yahushua's work was completed, and so there was a solid 500 years after his time period where during this time that the woman is protected overall. I'm not saying nobody died during that time, but there is a general protection where they're allowed to continue to exist. There was 500 years given for the gospel message to reach all of the children of Israel that were scattered all throughout the world wherever they went. And they were protected. No war, no flood could possibly overcome them during this time. They were given the opportunity to exist and then to receive the gospel message up until 538 AD, which is when the woman would then be turned over unto the beast. Hallelujah. So the woman is Israel, clothed with the sun. Now we're going to talk more about this in part 3 of what the different things mean with the different luminaries of the lights in the heavens and things. But clothed with the sun means in the favor of, and I'm going to prove with scripture why that is later on. But alright, so she is clothed with the sun and has the moon under her feet. Alright, she's founded upon the covenant. The moon is a sign of the covenant. And the crown of 12 stars on her head is all the 12 tribes together in unison. And she is travailing in birth pains and is about to give birth to a man-child. Okay, so we have to understand this is describing who and where Israel is at the moment that the man-child is going to be born. Alright, so she's still in favor, so it has to be before Israel was destroyed. Right, this is not a future event. She's in favor and she's founded upon the Torah. That means this is the moment right before she is destroyed, right at the culmination of her existence, in that capacity of being in favor and founded upon the covenant with all 12 stars on her head, not just 2. Okay, so in the ancient world, a man-child was the promise of a future. Kings obsessed over having male children as soon as possible because that secured their claim to the throne. People didn't want to serve a king who didn't have a son because it meant his line was coming to an end at his death. Okay, so you have to understand the magnitude of man-child or male child, why it's listed that way in Revelation. Okay, it's because this is a promise of future rule, of continuation. If you don't have a man-child as a man, your line is coming to an end. But if you do, that is the promise of a future. Alright, so in prophetic symbolic terms, which everything else in Revelation is, a man-child is a promise of a future. Okay, and so Israel was about to be destroyed, but it was prophesied that they would return to the land. And who was it said by? Isaiah, Yeshayahu. He was the prophet during the time that the northern kingdom Israel was destroyed. He was prophet during the time that this war in the heavens was going on, just like Hezekiah was the king. And if you remember, Yeshayahu, Isaiah, and Hezekiah had pretty interesting dealings one with another. Alright, but Isaiah is the one who said in Isaiah 1 and 9, except he had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we would have been likened unto Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah was completely destroyed, except for Lot. But Lot's not from Sodom. Lot migrated to Sodom. So there are no native-born Sodomites anywhere in the world. Now there's tons of Sodomites who are following after their fathers, the Sodomites, in way and deed, but not in blood. Right? Because Yahuwah wiped out Sodom from the face of the earth and did not leave a remnant. Now, Isaiah is saying here, unless there had been a remnant, then we would have been like Sodom. But there was a remnant. Okay, and Isaiah was acutely aware of this concept, and he proves that because Isaiah had a son around the time that Israel was destroyed and carried away captive. He named his son She'ar Yashub, which in Hebrew means a remnant shall return. So hallelujah, how amazing. Yeshayahu lived in the kingdom which did not fall at that time. Remember, the southern kingdom of Judah didn't fall for another, I believe, 100-something years later, maybe even 200. So he's not the one that's being carried away, but his heart grieves for the ones who are, for the 9.5 tribes that were destroyed of Israel and were taken captive by Assyria. So he names his own son She'ar Yashub. How incredible. Alright, and then, a lot of people think this man-child has to be talking about Yahushua Jesus, but it doesn't, and I want to show you the scripture here, Revelation 2:26. To he that overcomes and guards my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. Ooh, there's that star, the morning star. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the assemblies. So when it says that this man-child in Revelation 12 is going to rule all nations with a rod of iron, that does not have to be talking about the singular entity of the Messiah. I believe it's talking about the promise of a future, which is what a man-child was in the ancient times. That it's the remnant of her seed who is this man-child, right? And so he says here that if you guard his works unto the end, he'll give you power over the nations and you'll rule them with a rod of iron. So that's what's being talked about in Revelation 12. And then what is the other promise? I will give him the morning star. So who is this morning star? It's promised to the overcomers they will rule the nations with a rod of iron and also be given the morning star. Venus is the morning star. That same star that had a red tail and horns, and which once terrified all the nations of the earth after the great cataclysm of the 15th century BC, and which lost the war in the heavens in the 8th century BC. Right? So Yahushua is telling you, you will be given the morning star. Power over the enemy is what that means. And if you don't believe me that Venus is the morning star, go Google it right now. Pause this video, go to Google and type in, what's the morning star? Venus is the morning star. And we've spent this whole time talking about what Venus did in the sky and what it was symbolic of. Right? So now I want to talk about who Venus was representing during this time. Venus was approaching Earth in 722 BC because Satan saw this as his opportunity to devour the children of Israel when the favor was removed from them. They had been untouchable under Yahuwah's protection, but this was a moment that they were being divorced. So the star approached Earth to tell us that Satan was going to try to destroy Israel as soon as they were carried into captivity, which would in turn destroy the man-child or the promise of a future. Just as Venus was going to do so, Mars stepped in and whooped Venus, and many, many stars were seen falling to the earth as this battle was taking place. Now, remember what we read in Revelation 12. It says at the beginning part of Revelation 12 that the dragon positioned himself in such a way to consume the man-child as soon as it was born. So is it a coincidence that this war in the heavens is happening in 722 BC? That it lines up perfectly with the time that Israel is being destroyed and being taken captive. So, Satan understands that Israel was untouchable in their marriage covenant with the Father. But as soon as he divorces them, he sees this opportunity to be able to go down and destroy them. And in so doing, he would destroy the man-child. But he wasn't allowed to do that, was he? No, because see, there was a war in the heavens. And what did the middle part of Revelation 12 talk about? It talked about how Satan and his angels fought against Michael and his angels. And remember what we talked about, how Mars had a sword as its aura, right, that was around it. Just like Venus had horns and a tail, Mars had a sword, and they clashed in the heavens, and Venus was defeated, and all of the stars that were loyal to it were seen by the Chinese, who don't know the book of Revelation, who don't know Daniel, who don't know Isaiah, said that they saw the stars falling to the earth. What was happening in the celestial dance in the heavens was telling us what was happening in the real heavenlies, which is that Michael and his angels overcame Satan, and Satan lost his heavenly habitation. Now you remember Satan goes before the throne in the book of Job. So at that time he was still allowed to do that. He was the accuser of the brethren. He was given a heavenly audience to be able to come and accuse the people of the earth. But when he was defeated by Michael and his angels in 722 BC, he lost his heavenly habitation, and the celestial dance of the stars told us that when the wandering star Venus lost its horns and its tail and went into a subjective, planetary, obedient orbit, and is no longer terrorizing the nations, no longer doing the things that it used to do, and that was symbolized by what happened in the war in the heavens. So Satan lost that battle, right? And my last point here, Satan has been roaming the earth ever since, seeking whom he may devour. May is a term. If you ever asked your parents, can I have? And I don't know, can you? What they're waiting for you to say is, may I have, because it shows subservience. Satan has been roaming the earth ever since, seeking whom he may devour, who he's allowed to devour. The angels that fell with him are the ruling principalities that preside over nations. Okay, so what the Chinese saw in the form of the stars falling to the earth, that we now have an entire network of fallen angels, and they rule over certain different areas. Okay, so when you read in the book of Daniel that the prince of Persia withstood the angel Gabriel from being able to deliver a message for 2 weeks, somebody was fighting with Gabriel and preventing them from being able to deliver that message that's in Daniel, referred to as the prince of Persia. That was one of the fallen angels. Same thing for the king of Tyre from Ezekiel, the rulers of the darkness of this world from the book of Ephesians. Okay, there is a network of fallen angels, and the Freemasons are very well aware of this concept. All right, and that's why you see the number 72, and I'm not going to get into all that, but there's a network of fallen angels. The demons of this world have a hierarchy within themselves, and then at the highest level of the demonic kingdom, they answer to the fallen angels, and the fallen angels answer to their ringleader, who we call Satan, but he has a Hebrew name, and we're going to talk about that now. So, how art thou fallen? We've heard those words before, right? But I want to pay attention to the tense that is used in these places, because some people think that this hasn't happened yet, and they're waiting for Satan to fall to the earth, and woe unto the sea and the land, for the inhabitants of the earth, for the Satan has come down to you in great wrath. They think that hasn't already happened, but it has. Luke 10:17 and 18. So in this setting, Yahuwah was given authority over evil spirits to 70 followers to go before him into the cities where he's going and to cast out devils. And it says the 70 returned with joy, saying, Master, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. I saw that. It happened already. I watched it. And he goes on to tell them, I've given you power over the serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means harm you. But do not rejoice that the devils are subject unto you. Rather rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Right, so he's telling them, look, it's no big deal that the demons are subject to you. Of course they are. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. But it's important to know that's past tense language. So during Yahushua's lifetime, in the AD period of history, he's saying, I saw that happen. That already happened. Now it's important to know, I'm not talking about the original fall of Satan, when he became evil. Okay, there's no way that you can prove when that happened. I promise you, there's no way you can prove it. There's tons of theories. There's not enough scripture. We're not told how and when that happened. Okay, but we are told when he lost his heavenly habitation. He lost the ability to go before the throne like he did in the book of Job, and he now treads on his belly, eating the dust of the earth, which was something that was promised would happen back in Genesis, right? But so Isaiah was the one who lived during this war in the heavens. He experienced it. He saw the northern kingdom of Israel be destroyed and carried away captive, and so he watched this happen in the heavens, and then he wrote Isaiah 14:12 through 19. How have you fallen from the heavens, O Halel, son of the morning? So there's your morning star right there. This is talking about Satan. And so right here, Isaiah is talking some smack. He's like, how have you fallen from the heavens, O Halel, son of the morning? You have been cut down to the ground, you who laid low the nations, for you have said in your heart, let me go up to the heavens, let me raise my throne above the stars of El, and let me sit in the mount of appointment on the sides of the north. On the sides of the north, right? So the North Pole, Polaris never moves in the sky. I think Yahuwah's throne is probably right above where Polaris is, but that's a theory. Anyway, let me go up above the heights of the clouds. Let me be like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. Those who stare at you and ponder, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble? What have we been talking about? Cataclysms? This is the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world as a wilderness and destroyed its cities. Remember, when was the first time that Venus showed up? During the cataclysm that destroyed all of the cities of the earth at the time of the Exodus, right? So this is what he's saying. Yeshayahu is perfectly well aware of this concept, and who would not open the house of his prisoners? So, they're basically looking at him in pity. They're just like, is this the one who made the earth tremble and the shook kingdoms and made the world as a wilderness and destroyed its cities? How pathetic. He's cut down to the ground because that happened in 722 BC, because he abandoned his heavenly station. There he still was allowed an audience in the throne room until he tried to go down and destroy Israel when they were divorced. And for that action, Michael and his angels whooped his butt and sent him to the earth. And now he has dominion. He is the prince of the power of the air down here for a short time. It has been given to him. But that is the capacity in which he is now operating, and this is important for us as we move on into a spiritual warfare understanding. And I'm probably going to do a teaching soon to expound upon this concept, because you need to know who you're fighting. And you need to know that there's fallen angels out there, and that they're being, they're the ones that are orchestrating the demons within their territories, and that they ultimately answer to Satan. But you've got a lot more than just one enemy working against you. And, maybe sometime soon I'll talk more about that. But anyway, thank you for sticking with me to the end here. In part 3, I'm going to be talking much more about the individual meanings of the sun, moon, and stars, which I only briefly covered those today. And I'm going to also dive into Daniel chapter 9. Right? So we've dealt with a little bit of 7 and most of 8 and chapters of Daniel, and we did a lot in Revelation today, but I'm going to jump into Daniel chapter 9 next time. I'm going to give you the definitive unsealing of the book of the chapter of Daniel chapter 9 and how it relates to Yahushua's birth and his death and his resurrection. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the sign that the wise men saw. So remember, in the first part of the last teaching, we talked about a little bit about how wise men came from the east because they saw a star that told them that there was going to be a king born to the Jews. I'm going to tell you how they knew that and what I believe that meant. And anyway, we're going to see how all this is a fulfillment of the book of Daniel, which in my opinion is probably the single most incredible book of prophecy that there is, because of how just absolutely incredible the fulfillments are of this book. But anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling now. Thank you for listening, and keep your eyes open for part 3. Thanks.